So we are continuing through the account of Paul returning to Jerusalem after 20 years. After his missionary journeys are complete, he's now on his way to Rome, and he takes the side trip to Jerusalem. We talked about the last 2 weeks how it hasn't gone quite as he planned, and he fell into a trap of compromise, and then was put in prison and beaten, and now he remains in prison with his fate being dictated by a Roman commander. It's higher than Centurion, would have been a local commander of the Roman troops that are occupying Jerusalem. If you remember, he's been charged with something that is not true, that he brought the Gentiles into the temple, but at heart, the issue is what is true. Paul has been preaching the gospel, preaching Jesus and him crucified, and leading anyone he meets into the presence of God. The Jews are upset that they think that a Gentile has been brought into the physical temple. But the truth is, Paul has led Gentiles into the physical presence of God through the high priest, Jesus. It's so much better of a charge against him. And we saw how Paul gave his testimony. There's thousands of Jews who are upset with him, who are trying to kill him. The Roman commander saves him from the riot. And then Paul says, wait, I want to speak to these people. These are my brothers. These are the people that I want to be saved, who I'd give my life for, who I'd give my salvation for. And Paul lays out his testimony. And interestingly, if you remember, it goes pretty well until he mentions the Gentiles, until the truth of God conflicts with the pride of the Jews, with their arrogance, and the crowd goes crazy and wants to tear Paul from limb from limb. While he's doing it, if you remember, Paul is speaking, it's either Hebrew or Aramaic. We're not sure whether he's speaking Hebrew or Aramaic at the time. But the Roman commander doesn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. So he hears Paul speaking, and he sees the crowd reacting favorably until he gets to a certain point, and then the crowd goes insane and wants to kill him again. So when we pick up in verse 23 and 24, we see it's in the middle of that point. The crowd is going crazy, and the Roman commander is responding. It says, and as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle, and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. It's a good reminder for us, particularly as Christians in a world that seems to be turning against Christ, in a country that seems to be turning against Christ, that just because there is a tumult, a riot, a bunch of people getting upset, getting angry with someone, angry with us, doesn't mean we're doing the wrong thing. Just because our witness is received unfavorably and everyone disagrees with us, it doesn't mean we're doing the wrong thing. If we're preaching the word of God in a world that has by and large rejected God, we're going to get bad responses sometimes, as Paul does. The Roman commander doesn't really care. He doesn't really care why they're upset with him. He just is like Pontius Pilate when Jesus has a crowd turning against him. He just wants peace. He's trying to do his job and keep everyone happy. So because there is a riot, because people are upset, he does what a Roman commander at that time would do. He orders that Paul be scourged so that he would admit all that he's done wrong, all his crimes. He sees thousands of people upset with one person. He immediately thinks that guy had to do something wrong. Scourging is not a minor thing. Scourging is not something that we deal with in this world today generally. But it involves a whip of many leather cords with either glass or heavy metal pieces embedded in it. Often there's a little bead at the end with a little hook on the end. And the person being scourged they take off the person's shirt and tie them with thongs, leather thongs, to a post in a bent over position like this. And then they use the scourge to open their back, to whip them repeatedly. If you've ever seen the Passion of the Christ, that's what happened to Jesus, that horrible scene. But the Romans were generally horrible. They were brutal, nasty, authoritative people. In the Roman world, if you were Roman, this should not have happened to you. If you were a Gentile, essentially, if you were non-Roman, if you were non-citizen, the Roman army could do whatever they want with you. And that is the order from the Roman commander. He thinks Paul is not a citizen. He thinks he's a troublemaker. So let's beat him until he's almost dead, until we find out what he's done wrong. Often with scourging, the victim of scourging would die before he admitted anything. So you've got a Roman commander who's willing, in his desire to do his job, in his hardness. He's a high-ranking Roman who's fought lots of battles, most likely. He's willing to kill Paul to put down this riot. He's willing to beat him almost to death. But in verse 25, he's stopped very quickly. It says, "And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? And Paul said, Yeah. Obviously he didn't say yeah, just, yeah, I'm a Roman. All right. The Roman commander, he's in the army. And those of you who've been in the military understand the power structure involved. Even though this Roman commander is higher than a centurion, we don't know exactly where he stands in the rank structure for Jerusalem at that point. But he's clearly under some authority. He's not the emperor of Rome. He knows that he gives orders that are within his authority, but there are certain laws that he cannot break. There's certain authority that he is under. There's judgment that he faces if he breaks the law. One part that he cannot touch is the law that covers the citizens of Rome. Specifically here, Paul has said, I'm a citizen of Rome. At that point, the Roman army, the Roman justice system, could not scourge a Roman citizen unless they were convicted of a crime. The Roman justice system couldn't even bind a Roman citizen unless they were convicted of a crime. At this point, the Roman commander has ordered Paul scourged. He has bound him. He has treated him badly. And Paul brings it to him that you have committed a crime. You have exceeded your authority. You are in danger of judgment. Because the Roman commander understands authority and understands that he serves at the will of Caesar, at the will of those above him, what response does he get? He immediately backs up. He immediately backs off. He immediately tries to fix the situation. Paul's citizenship as a Roman is what saves him. He is a citizen of the Roman Empire, subject to the rules set out by the Roman king, the Caesar. It's likely the same citizenship that Paul is thinking about in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, when he says our citizenship is in heaven. Because he is a Roman citizen, he is subject to Caesar and the rules that are set out by Caesar. He is protected by Caesar. No one can do anything to Paul unless Paul violates the laws set out by Caesar. He's protected within the rules and regulations set out by Caesar. We as citizens of heaven are subject to our King, Jesus. No one can do anything to us outside of the rules set out by our King, unless we violate them, unless we go outside of his will. It is a special protection that is set out for us. In verse 26, though, it says even further, it says, when the centurion heard that, 27, then the chief captain came and said unto him, tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, yes. And the chief captain answered, with great sums I obtained this freedom. And Paul said, but I was born free. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. It's kind of a strange interaction when you just read it, but it has to deal with the class of citizen, the protection afforded to Paul versus his Roman commander. The Roman commander has started off as a non-citizen. It was common in a Roman army that if you served for a period of time and paid a certain amount of money, if you started off as a Gaul in France, you could buy citizenship after a certain amount of time. Or if you remained in the army, I think it was for 25 or 30 years, you can become a citizen at the end. It's an earned citizenship, and it would never be the same as someone who was born as a citizen of the Roman Empire. One is a citizen by works. They have to work their whole life to get to the point where they're a tenuous citizen. Rome could always turn against those people because they're always outsiders. They're always originally from the outer regions of Rome. They're not the same as people who were born as a citizen. That's the Roman commander. On the other hand, you have Paul. Paul has been born a citizen. His rights were gained just through his relationship with his father, with his parents. He didn't do anything to earn that citizenship. Does it sound familiar? Paul is like us. We're born again into citizenship in heaven. Our rights will always be better than those who try to work their way into a relationship with God. There's nothing we do or don't do that changes the fact that we're citizens, that we are protected and loved and entitled to all the rights of children of God, our Father. And you see the response of the Roman commander. And first, the people who were going to scourge Paul, they just get out of there. They're just good. Oh, we don't want any part of this. And the Roman commander does also. He realizes, and it's very important what he realizes. He realizes he has sinned, essentially. And under his belief system, under his rules, he has committed a great sin. And he is under authority. And he realizes that he went outside of the rules set out. So immediately sees the sin, sees the violation, repents, and turns away from his sin because he doesn't want judgment. He's not a godly man. There's no God involved here. But he responds as we all should when we go outside of the rules set out for us, when we sin. There is someone greater than this Roman commander, someone who is holding judgment over him. So he immediately moves to change his conduct and to fix the situation. There's a power to be feared, and he moves in response. Verse 30 says, on the morrow, because he would have known the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews. The next day, the Roman commander is trying to find out why this whole thing is still going on. He's still trying to do his job within the confines of the rules that bind him. The Roman commander loosed Paul from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all the council to appear. And brought Paul down and set him before him. So there's still a riot going on, and the Roman commander still wants to find out what happened. He doesn't want insurrection on his watch. So he brings out the Sanhedrin, and we've dealt with the Sanhedrin quite a few times in the book of Acts. They are the priests and the scribes, Sadducees and Pharisees, the upper crust of Jewish society. 70 plus one, the one being the high priest. And they are kind of in charge of Jewish life, Jewish law in Jerusalem and in Israel. They are kind of like the Supreme Court, Congress, the president, and then the Pope, if you're Catholic, all mixed together. They are the head of the legal system, the laws, the judicial system, and the religious system in Israel. And the Roman commander calls them out and says, come on, let's fix this problem. We'll have Paul stand before you and present his defense, why this is going on. If you remember also, there's a good argument that Paul was previously a member of the Sanhedrin before Christ found him or confronted him on the road to Damascus. At Stephen's stoning, it says he approves of what they're doing. So he's possibly on the Sanhedrin voting in favor of killing Stephen. We're not sure it's a good argument, but he certainly was from the upper crust of the Jewish society. He was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He's the student of Gamaliel. So even 20 years later, he likely has interacted with a lot of these 70 guys that are sitting there in judgment on him. And in chapter 23, verse 1, Paul starts off with his defense. And it says, "And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, 'Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day.'" So he's earnestly beholding them. He's not taking this appointment lightly. He stands there and looks at them. You know, you get the picture, the idea that he's looking into their souls. And in this case, there's a lot of blackness there. And he starts off by saying, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." When he says, "I have lived in all good conscience," he's not saying that he has never sinned. He's not saying that his conscience does not prick him, that does not convict him, does not cause him to repent. He's essentially talking about what we should have in our lives every day, a close relationship with God, that in his life, when he has been convicted, when he has realized that he has sinned, he has brought it to his Lord. He has repented and laid it at the Lord's feet, laid himself at the Lord's feet, and asked for forgiveness. Because our Lord already took the punishment for everything we did and will do. The Lord picks Paul up and sets him back on his feet and sets him back on his way. His conscience is clear because Jesus paid the price for his sin. Jesus worked it out. Jesus' blood covers his sin and washes it away, so that his conscience can be as white as snow now because of Jesus. It's not a matter of justification, because Jesus already took care of that, but just saying, I have a relationship with God. I worked it out. There's nothing weighing me down. I'm clear. Likely he's going to lay the gospel before them, and perhaps, like we just saw, lay out his testimony, how he got to that place to his fellow Jews. Do you think there's anybody more qualified to speak to the Sanhedrin about Jesus than Paul at this point? An apostle who's met Jesus, who was either possibly a member of Sanhedrin, but certainly knew all these guys, did all the same things. And their response is shocking. In verse 2, it says, "And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by Paul to smite him on the mouth. They don't even give him a chance to respond. They don't even give him a chance to defend himself. They have no interest in hearing what Paul has to say. He gets a couple of words out, and they smack him across the face. It shouldn't really be that surprising. How did they treat Jesus, his master? Jesus had all the evidence in his favor. He did miracles and raised people from the dead. And they beat him and smacked him across the face because he opposed them in their view. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited walls, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law. Paul saying in King James language, originally likely in Hebrew or Aramaic, you hypocrites, you whitewashed walls, you whitewashed tombs, as Jesus said. You look great on the outside, but your heart, your soul is dead. It's filled with death and corruption and stink. Specifically, in the Deuteronomy, the duties of the high priest are set out, and duties of the Sanhedrin are set out. And a person is brought before the Sanhedrin innocent until proven guilty. According to Deuteronomy 25, 1 and 2, you're not allowed to beat a person brought before the Sanhedrin unless they are found guilty. The Sanhedrin, the high priest, they are put in their position by God, and they claim to love the law. They claim that the law is everything to them, and yet they're not following the law. They're beating someone who is innocent because Paul offends their pride. He offends their position. He offends them personally. They're supposed to be there to find the truth, to work on behalf of God to find the truth. And they have no interest in doing so. They're there to protect themselves, to protect their arrogance. Specifically, and Ananias was known to be a thief. He was conspiring with the Romans. He would steal from the temple. He just wants to protect his money and his power, and the fact that he loved his place at feasts up in the front. He loved his dress, and the people respected him. So it didn't really matter whether Paul was speaking from God. If it offended Ananias, and that person was worthy of being hit and beaten up and killed. It's a huge abuse of the power that God has given them and the position that God has put them in. And Paul responds in a really interesting way. And it seems like he's being somewhat prophetic in his rebuke. He says, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. God is going to take care of you. Judgment is coming to you, even you, high priest and Sanhedrin. Like the Roman commander, they have great power. They have great position. They have great authority. But there are rules that they should follow. They are under greater authority, in this case, God. And they have violated the very law that they're charged with keeping. The difference between the Roman commander and the high priest and Sanhedrin, though, is look at the response. The high priest doesn't care. The Sanhedrin doesn't care. They are so far into their sin and so wrapped up in themselves that they just keep going, that they have no fear of God whatsoever. With the Roman commander, he is appointed by Rome, and he exceeds his power. He breaks the law. But because he's aware of Caesar, he's aware of the might and power and authority above him, immediately when he realizes he has broken the law, he's afraid of the judgment to come. He knows that the judgment is certain, and he needs to escape the judgment. So he turns around, he repents, and tries to fix the situation. The high priest is appointed by God himself. He goes outside of the law, he opposes God, he breaks the law, he's in rebellion, his heart is hardened. But because he has no fear of God, the one who put him in this position, he doesn't repent, he doesn't turn around, he doesn't think there's going to be any judgment. In Proverbs 9, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The high priest, Ananias, has no fear of the Lord, so he has no wisdom. It's not possible for him to turn around because he doesn't think he's under authority. In the Christian life, we can do the same. We can forget, we can lose sight of the authority that we are under. We can focus on the grace, and grace is a wonderful thing, and lose sight of the fact that we serve an awesome, just, mighty God. We can think that all the gifts that we have, and all the talents that we have, and all the abilities that we have come from us. In 1 Corinthians 4, the question asked by Paul to the Corinthians who are thinking a lot of themselves and losing the fear of God is, what do you have that hasn't been given to you? Is there anything that we have that has not been given to us by God? Our salvation, our very breath in our lungs. Every breath is given from God. Do we have the fear of the Lord as we are in our workplace, as we are dealing with our families, as we are trying to get up on our high horse and feel outraged at other people? Do we remember what God did for us when we were like the Roman commander, the high priest, and went outside of the rules and deserved judgment? Even the fact that the rebuke from Paul sounds a lot like Jesus when he said, "Your whitewashed tombs," has no effect on Ananias. He doesn't realize that judgment is coming for him also, even though he's the high priest. Jesus talks a lot about men like Ananias. I think because it's a tendency in all of us. We want to make it about us. We want to hold on to our sin, hold on to our pride, our riches, our position. Anything that keeps us away from God and keeps us comfortable is what Satan pushes us to do. In Luke chapter 12, he tells the parable, Jesus. In verse 16, Luke chapter 12, he says, "And he spoke a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? In Luke 13, Jesus talking about servants and stewards and how we are supposed to act. In verse 42 in Luke 13 says, "And the Lord said, Who then is that faithful and wise steward, whom his Lord shall make ruler over his household, to give them their portion of meat in due season? Blessed is that servant, whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Of a truth I say unto you, that he will make him ruler over all that he has. And if that servant say in his heart, My Lord delayeth coming, there is no judgment, there is no authority or power over me, and shall begin to beat the men servants and maidens, and to eat and drink, and to be drunken, the Lord of that servant will come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in sunder, and will appoint him his portion with the unbelievers." It doesn't matter that Ananias is the high priest over all of Israel. It doesn't matter what our position is. It doesn't matter in this earth how far we've gotten. In Revelation 20, verse 11, it says, "And I saw a great white throne, and him that sit on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and the death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. And they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." God makes a promise that judgment is coming. Judgment is coming for everyone. And God is not slow to keep his promise, says 2 Peter. But he wants everyone to be saved. But because God so loved the world, he sent his only Son, his only begotten Son, so that we don't have to be judged according to our works. It says according to our works, and in our pride we think, and Ananias in his pride thinks, that's a great thing, my work, I work hard. And we ignore all the times that we go outside the bounds, all the times we rely on ourselves and our pride. And if we face God in our works, the end is not pretty for us. But if we face God in Jesus, then we get well done and good and faithful servant. He died so that that could be our lot. Ananias is a steward. He's a servant. He is a chosen servant of God, given great position. But instead of serving his Lord, he serves riches and power and position and pride. He's a corrupt politician, essentially, at this point. And what is God's response? You fool. I've given you such great things, and you're a fool. The thing that Ananias doesn't know, much like the rich man tearing down his barns, it's the late 50s AD, early 60s AD, depending on how you do the timing at this point. The Jewish rebellion against Rome takes place at the end of the 60s, 66 AD, and by 70 AD, Rome is destroyed. One of the first things that happens when the Jews revolt is that the rebels go after Ananias, and they hunt him down like a dog, and they murder him because he conspires with the Romans, because he's corrupt. And he faces judgment. The judgment is not pleasant, not pretty, but it's certain. And when Paul is there, and this is fifth or sixth time, depending on whether the Sanhedrin is there, when Stephen is stoned, that he's been offered. The Sanhedrin has had Peter before it preaching the gospel. They've had Jesus before it preaching the gospel. They've had the apostles before it preaching the gospel. They have another chance here to hear the message that would set Ananias and the rest of them free from judgment. That'll give them eternal life that could wash away all their sins. And instead, they punch Paul in the mouth. There's going to be a time. God is patient. God is loving. But some people harden their hearts, and they turn completely away from Him. Their hearts are stone, and they're not going to hear. And Paul leaves them alone. He turns away. Judgment, he leaves them to God's judgment. Verse 4 says, and they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, or I knew not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Paul evidently has spoken harshly also, saying that judgment is coming and calling him a hypocrite is not particularly fun and respectful either, but it's truth. But it seems like Paul has spoken out of turn to the high priest, and he is apologizing because he respects God's position, even if the man in that position is repugnant. He's not going to dishonor God simply because the man who's filling the position set out by God is wrong. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. And when he said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose, and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them, and to bring him into the castle. Paul sees how turned against God they are, and after being punched in the mouth, he sees that this is going nowhere, that they don't want to hear it, they don't have eyes to see, they don't have ears to hear. So he's extricating himself out and leaving the Sanhedrin up to God. God has already done a great work among the Sanhedrin. Remember Joseph of Arimathea, he's from the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus, he's from the Sanhedrin. It says in the book of Acts that many priests have come to faith at this point. These guys have seen the truth. They are the teachers of Israel, and they have specifically, willfully rejected the truth. So Paul says, I'm out of here. This is between you and God. And he does so in good conscience. The dissension is based on their pride-filled doctrine. And when they say, if he's following God, does anybody really believe that they really are believing him? The Pharisees are protecting Pharisees. The Sadducees are protecting the Sadducees. And there's another riot that they have to pull Paul out of. And this has been a really hard time for Paul. I have had bad days before, but I've never had a multiple riot, insult the high priest, get punched by guards, compromise, completely everything that happened day before. I've had bad days, but this is quite a day. After returning to Israel after 20 years, trying to get how long do you think Paul was thinking about going back to Israel and speaking to the Sanhedrin and speaking to his brothers and sisters in Judaism? And everything goes wrong. at least probably according to Paul. He's got thousands of people before him, and he gets a chance to tell his testimony, and no one listens. A riot happens, and no one listens. He gets before the Sanhedrin, and he insults the high priest. Not a good thing. He certainly understands that. But look what happens. Paul compromises and fails. He wants to preach, and he doesn't do a very good job of it, at least according to him. People don't come to faith. It's not a successful ministry according to him. But Jesus, verse 11 says, "And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul. For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome.'" Paul lost his temper, and Jesus is still with him. Paul compromises, and Jesus is still with him. Paul, by our earthly view, fails in his testimony, and Jesus is still with him. Jesus shows up when we're discouraged, when we're tired. Paul's been beaten quite a bit now. He's in pain. In the nighttime, by himself in jail, Jesus shows up. He, in this case, shows himself visibly, but he's with us always. He promises, Matthew 28, "I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." In Hebrews, "I will never leave you or forsake you." No matter how badly Paul is feeling about himself, Jesus is there. And look what he says. He says, "Be of good cheer." Your version might have "take courage" or "be of good comfort." How many times has Jesus said that? When the apostles are out in the boat and he's walking on water. Be of good cheer, take courage. To the leper when he's about to heal him, or the palsied man. Be of good cheer, take courage, be of good comfort. I, Jesus, am here. And when Jesus is here, he changes everything. If we're just aware of it. What's more, when it says, Paul, "For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem." In English, it's just saying "as you testified," but the original language is indicating that "as you testified for me earnestly." As you testified for me solemnly. As you testified for me in a manner that would get people to believe. He's saying, "Good job, Paul. I'm not worried about those mistakes you made." He doesn't bring up compromise. He doesn't bring up anger. He doesn't bring up anything. He says, "You did a good job. Well done, good and faithful servant. You testified well. I love you, my brother. Keep going." When we use our mind or our emotions or our experience to try to define Jesus' response and how he treats us and how he looks at us, we most often go wrong. We think Jesus is going to be disappointed in us. We think that Jesus is going to be judging us. We think that God's going to think we're a failure. Paul has had an uneven day, to say the least. And Jesus shows up and says he cares for his physical and mental situation. He says, "Don't be afraid. Be of good courage. Be of good cheer. I'm with you." And then he doesn't judge him. He says, "Good job." He understands the gap. He's way up here. We are way down here. He understands that we are little in the scheme of things, and we mess up all the time, and yet he still loves us. And he says, "Good job." And what's more, Paul is in jail. He wants to go to Rome. He says he thinks that's God's call on him earlier in our passages. And what does Jesus say? Good job. You preached in such a way that people should believe you, whether they do or not. Now you're going to go and preach in Rome. No matter the fact that there's a couple of years gap between the time here and he gets to Rome. He gives Paul certainty of what's going to happen between now and then. He comforts him and charges him again. The Roman commander responded to when he made a mistake, when he sinned, when he violated the rules, out of fear of punishment. Ananias didn't respond because he had no knowledge of what he should fear and the judgment that is to come. We, like Paul, can be certain that even though we deserve judgment, even though we fall short all the time in ways that Ananias did, in the ways that the Roman commander did, and everyone before us. Because Jesus died for us and set us free from that judgment. We know that Jesus is with us and standing by us and not focusing on our sin, but saying, good job, take courage, keep going. Because of the joy set before us, you can trust me. I'm with you. I love you. Just keep going. Our Master died for us so we can keep going. And we will stop there. Father, thank you for the time today.